Hello and welcome to Impact, the show addressing topical issues for young adults. I'm Noah Smith and today we'll be exploring an important issue that many people don't want to talk about: teenage depression. What systems are there for prevention and for help? We'll be asking a range of experts alongside the general public on their views of awareness and the support available. We also talk to those who can offer services to help people in need. But first, Charlie speaks with Steve Mallon, whom under unfortunate circumstances started a charity to tackle this modern crisis.
Could you tell us about Edward's story and what happened there? I know it's a very kind of sensitive subject, but I think it's important for people to kind of know about these things and therefore kind of rid ourselves of this stigma.
Yes, of course. In this particular case, my son came from an excellent home, a well-educated, stable family, affluent environment, and through the course of his life had never encountered any difficulties at all. Indeed, he was a consummate individual in the sense as he was academically brilliant. He'd been offered a place here at Cambridge University. A mental illness is a disease just like any other disease, and it can impact upon absolutely anybody. Edward fell into a clinical depression very rapidly and very sharply, just after his 18th birthday, actually, very, very sad. And he went from being a wonderful, vibrant, happy, outward-going young man with a brilliant future, to being in catastrophic despair, really within the space of 2 to 3 months. It was remarkably quick and very severe in that regard. Obviously this culminated in him, taking his own life. Now, the simple fact of the matter is that my son would still be alive if only he'd asked for help. If only he'd asked his family for help, his friendship group, his teachers. And unfortunately, Edward's story is by no means unique. A man commits suicide in this country every 2 hours.
Could you tell me about your charity and what it is you do to help young people?
Essentially, my charity is designed to improve mental health literacy within the education system. It's become very well established now that 75% of all mental illness in our society predates the end of higher education in origin. It obviously therefore means that if we want to do something about mental illness, my son suffered from severe clinical depression, then the appropriate target and the appropriate group to focus on are obviously young adults and young people and children.
Could you tell us about some of the goals that you've achieved and some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, essentially, if it doesn't sound too melodramatic, obviously the death of my son had a terrible impact on myself and my family. And the origins of this charity are quite simple. I stood next to my son's coffin in church at his funeral, and I made him a public promise that I would investigate his untimely death, and also at the same time I would seek improvement on behalf of his generation. I then devoted many months to researching what is actually a very complicated sector, which obviously involves health, education, politics and the school system, etc., etc., in order to try and understand where the real problems lie. What we primarily and firstly need to do is to destroy the stigma which surrounds this issue, which prevents people coming forward and asking for help at an early stage when they need that assistance. And very much core to the centre of what my objectives are is that I would like to give the NHS less to do in the first place. Quite simply, my son should never have got that ill. But make no mistake, mental illness and suicide are very important humanitarian issues, and the more we speak about them, these are not taboo subjects, the better.
Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
Mental illness and depression affects us all, but is it a growing issue? We went out on the streets of Cambridge to ask the public on their views of teenage depression.
I definitely think it's on the increase. Primarily, I'd say because there's more access to the internet and social media is becoming a much bigger thing. And I think cyberbullying is really, one of the main causes of depression.
I think with the social media phenomenon, I think a lot of children are getting very isolated from each other and from adults' interactions.
Well, yeah, ever since I was at school, really, it was getting bad, and people were getting bullied and depression was happening and that, and I've noticed it a bit more.
Anything can trigger it, really. I think that maybe just having a bad experience from someone in the past could increase your chances or could upset you, that affects you in the long term.
There's there's posters from places to places saying there's call lines, you know, for helping and trying to support them. But I don't think there's enough, I wouldn't say advertisement, but I don't think there's enough word about them for people to know.
I think there isn't enough help because, I mean, for instance, someone who's depressed in my school, maybe self-harming, would just go to the school nurse or maybe they wouldn't even tell anyone about it. And I think it's really important that everyone should be encouraged to let other people know, when they're depressed or when they're self-harming, that sort of thing.
My view is that we treat people with mental health difficulties as if they're different to the rest of us, and I don't believe that is the case. You know, about a quarter or more of us will suffer from some kind of mental health issue in our lifetime. It's ordinary. And wouldn't it be fabulous if we could think about it like we think about going to see the dentist or, you know, going for physiotherapy if we've got something wrong with our joints, that it's just ordinary that we go to see a therapist for psychological issues.
It's quite difficult for parents and friends to tell, because depressed individuals by definition don't talk about what's going on in their heads. But what you can notice is that they're quiet, they're not communicating properly, they're not themselves, or they'll find themselves sitting there perhaps not participating in the things they normally do, even their own personal hobbies.
And I think one of the problems we have is a lack of understanding it could be any one of us. You know, there's nothing intrinsically different about people who suffer from mental health difficulties. In the right circumstances, it would be any of us.
And I would recommend that school is a good place for you to seek advice and help from a teacher you trust who could take you in the right direction. For some individuals, they might find that going to their doctor as a first port of call is a useful place to go. Finally, there are open access places like organisations like Centre 33, where you can go and seek advice independently of school or doctors or your parents if you feel that you want to be comfortable with an independent and neutral person who might well be a qualified counsellor in the first instance.
So for us, the young people that we are that come into us are mainly struggling with anxiety and with low moods or kind of depressive phases. So the young person can ring us up and can arrange for an appointment to access counselling. The very first appointment would be an initial assessment, and it would be about the hopes of the young person, the expectation of the young person, and a kind of needs assessment. What are their needs? What are they experiencing in this situation? And it's not so much based on handing out a diagnosis or working with a diagnosis, but working with a young person. What are they experiencing? Where do they experience difficulties? And then if the young person after this first initial assessment decides that they would want to continue with the therapeutic intervention, then we offer up to 6 sessions, and that's kind of ongoing sessions, so with the same person once a week for 6 weeks.
To further understand the treatment of depression among young people, in the studio with me today is Esther McNeil. Thank you for joining me, Esther. So what do Cogwheel Trust do?
We offer talking therapies where young people can come in and talk to a counsellor about what they're going through. And that really suits some young people. Some young people just really need an environment where they're able to be heard. When people are depressed, they're often battling with a huge array of very, very difficult emotions. And some of these feelings can be really difficult to articulate. So that's where the creative art therapies come in. Unfortunately, what happens in depression often is that those very, very difficult feelings can be turned inwards. So the anger is turned in on themselves. And that can often look like self-harm in young people, which has grown hugely over the last 20 years. Hospital admissions have grown. Somewhere between 1 in 12 and 1 in 15 people self-harm, and it's overwhelmingly a young person's mode of expression. So if the counsellors are able to work with a young person to find other ways to express those very difficult feelings, then they're far less likely to resort to those much more damaging and destructive ways of expressing themselves, and find some healing, and to be able to really tell their story, I guess, about what is going on for them and to find some solutions for themselves.
What are your opinions on antidepressants?
Now, there are side effects sometimes for some people, and it's a very personal decision about whether or not to take antidepressants. But the evidence shows that antidepressants can work very, very well for depression, and actually the best outcomes are sometimes shown to be where clients are on a course of antidepressants and having counselling or psychotherapy. So that's a decision really for each individual young person and their families potentially, and their GP.
So why is mental health not the same priority as physical health in terms of well-being?
I think it's been a long-standing issue that we haven't talked about mental health issues in the same way that we talk about physical health issues, and it is changing. Slowly, there is much more awareness. I think people talking about in the public eye, talking about their mental health issues, makes a huge difference, and I hope that carries on.
Thank you very much for coming, Esther.
Thank you.
From what we've seen, teenage depression is a growing issue, but there are people out there to help. The lack of research into this area is worrying, as pressures are stacking up for young people. If you are in need of help, please contact your school, doctor, or one of your local charities, as they are there to help you. I'm Noah Smith, and this has been Impact.